Part 1. Cold doesn't care. Winter doesn't care what you believe. It doesn't care how hard you work, how smart you think you are, or how many winters you've survived before. When the cold decides to stay, it only respects one thing: what actually works. I've lived long enough out here to see strong men humbled by a single night of bad weather. I've watched well-built cabins turn into traps, and I've seen families lose everything because they trusted what everyone else said was the right way. And that's why this story matters. Because one man didn't try to fight winter. He stepped out of its way. 15 seconds is all it takes for most people to scroll past a video like this. But if you've ever wondered how you'd survive when fuel runs low, when the power is gone, when help isn't coming, then stay with me. What you're about to hear isn't theory, it's not modern hype. It's old knowledge that still works, even when the temperature drops to -37. Out here on the frontier, winter isn't a season, it's a test. And most people fail it the same way. They build taller, they burn more, they fight harder, and they lose anyway. But every once in a while, someone remembers a different answer, not louder, not bigger, just wiser. This is the story of a home the neighbors called Madness, until it became the warmest place in the valley. Part 2. When the neighbors started watching, the place was called Canyon Ridge Valley, tucked into the western edge of Idaho Territory, and the year was 1894. Autumn arrived early that year, sharp and unforgiving. Frost coated the grass before sunrise, and the wind rolling down from the high country carried a warning no one could ignore. So people did what people always do when winter is coming. They rushed. Logs were stacked higher, chinking was packed tighter. Chimneys were raised thicker and taller, as if stone and smoke alone could scare the cold away. Every cabin followed the same shape, the same logic, the same mistakes repeated from one winter to the next. Everyone, except Elias Korven. Instead of hauling logs, Elias took a shovel and walked to the hillside behind his claim. And then, without ceremony, without announcement, he started digging straight into the earth. At first, folks thought he was cutting a root cellar. Then the hole grew deeper, longer, wider. Day after day, more earth piled up, and still no cabin frame went up. That's when people began to stop and stare. Horses slowed on the trail, conversations trailed off. A few men laughed, a few shook their heads. Someone finally said what everyone was thinking. He's burying himself before winter gets the chance. Caleb Whitmore, the valley's most respected builder, was the loudest voice among them. He'd raised cabins across 2 territories and survived winters most men wouldn't talk about. When Caleb said something wouldn't last, people listened. And Caleb said that hole in the hill would kill a family. What made it worse wasn't just what Elias was doing. It was how little he explained. He didn't argue, he didn't defend himself, he just kept digging. That silence unsettled people more than any speech could have. Because confidence like that usually comes from one of 2 places. Part 3. The man who knew something they didn't. Elias Korven wasn't a loud man. He didn't carry himself like someone trying to prove a point. But there was something steady about him, something you notice only after you've lived long enough to recognize it. He moved like someone who had seen winter win before. What the neighbors didn't know, or didn't care to ask, was where his certainty came from. Elias hadn't learned his ideas from books or blueprints. He carried them the way old families carry memory. His mother had grown up in a hillside home far across the ocean, in a land where winters were longer, darker and colder than anything Canyon Ridge had ever seen. Homes there weren't raised to challenge the cold. They were set into the land to escape it. As a boy, Elias listened to stories about rooms carved from earth, about walls that never froze, about small fires that warmed entire homes because the ground itself did most of the work. No one called it science. No one called it engineering. They just called it surviving. At the trading post one evening, when someone finally pressed him for an explanation, Elias spoke quietly, like a man explaining something obvious. "The ground doesn't change with the weather," he said. "Only the air does." That sentence didn't impress anyone. Men laughed because they had spent their lives fighting winter above ground. They trusted what they could see: thick logs, roaring fires, smoke pouring into the sky like a declaration of defiance. What Elias trusted couldn't be seen at all. He trusted what was below the frost line, below the wind, below the noise. And while the valley prepared for winter, the only way it knew how, Elias Korven kept digging, shaping a home that didn't look like strength, but understood it. Because the most dangerous mistake people make in hard country isn't building weak. It's believing the old way is the only way. And Winter was about to decide who was right. Part 4, what he built, but not why it worked. By late October, the hole in the hillside had stopped looking like a hole. It had shape now. Elias Korven cut 15 feet into the south-facing slope, angling the tunnel just slightly upward. Not enough to notice at a glance, but enough so cold air wouldn't settle and stay. The entrance wasn't wide. It wasn't tall. It didn't welcome winter in. It resisted it quietly. The doorway sat recessed into a short stone throat, a narrow chamber before the main living space. Anyone stepping inside would pass through that cold pocket first, letting the worst of the outside air fall away before it could reach the heart of the home. Beyond that, the space opened low and wide, carved directly from clay and stone. The ceiling wasn't high enough to waste heat. The walls weren't finished smooth. They were thick, dense, and unyielding, holding the cool firmness of the earth itself. At the back of the chamber, Elias built a small stove. Not the kind most frontier families relied on. No massive firebox, no roaring appetite for wood. Just enough iron to hold a controlled flame. From that stove, the flue didn't rush upward like everyone expected. Instead, it ran horizontally through the wall before turning and rising through a lined shaft, bored carefully toward the crest of the hill. A design that made the neighbors uneasy, because it broke a rule they all thought was unbreakable. Smoke, they believed, must go straight up. Anything else was asking for death. Sleeping spaces were carved directly into the earth, shallow alcoves set back from the main room. Canvas partitions could be drawn at night, holding warmth close without sealing off air. There were no windows, no wasted corners, no unnecessary openings for the cold to claw through. From the outside, it looked crude, almost desperate. But anyone who understood harsh country would have noticed something unsettling. Nothing about the structure was accidental. Elias wasn't guessing, he was executing something he already trusted. And that made the neighbors nervous. Part 5. The expert says he will die when the talk finally reached Caleb Whitmore. He didn't dismiss it with jokes. He went to see it. Caleb stood at the entrance to the hillside home one cold afternoon, hands on his belt, eyes narrowing as he took it in. He didn't need to step inside to start listing the problems. "Dirt holds moisture," he said flatly. "Moisture rots wood and sickens families." He pointed at the recessed doorway. "Cold air will pool right there and creep inside." Then at the flue design. "Smoke won't draw right. Horizontal run like that? You'll choke yourselves out before Christmas." By the time Caleb finished, half the valley had gathered behind him, listening like students at a lesson. This was a man whose judgment had kept families alive for decades. And his verdict was brutal. "That place will kill you," he told Elias, "not all at once, slowly. Damp air, weak heat. One bad freeze, and that ceiling will crack. You still have time to tear this out and build a real cabin." Others nodded, a few crossed themselves again. What made the moment uncomfortable wasn't the criticism. It was Elias's response. He didn't argue. He didn't defend his choices. He didn't try to convince anyone. He simply thanked Caleb for his concern and went back to work. That was when doubt crept in, not just for the neighbors, but for Elias's own family. Because when a respected expert says you're wrong and everyone agrees with him, confidence starts to feel a lot like stubbornness. Winter was getting closer, and mistakes out here don't wait politely to be corrected. Part 6. The family moves in, silence before the storm. The first snow came early in November, not a storm, just a warning. And that was when Elias moved his family inside. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just the quiet transfer of life from the open valley into the earth. Tools were carried in, bedding laid out, canvas hung. A small fire lit in the stove, no bigger than what most families used to boil water. That detail didn't go unnoticed. "See," someone whispered at the trading post. "He's already rationing wood." People expected panic. They expected adjustments. They expected Elias to admit the cold felt wrong inside that hill. None of it came. Days passed, then weeks. The chimney never poured smoke like the others. The fire never roared. And that, more than anything, convinced the valley the experiment was failing. Because frontier wisdom had one unshakable rule. When winter comes, you burn big or you freeze. Elias Korven was doing neither. By December, most families had written off the hillside home as a slow-moving tragedy. Quiet plans were made, spare beds discussed. Who would take in the children? Who would shelter the wife? No one said it out loud, but everyone was waiting for the knock on the door, waiting for Elias to admit he was wrong. What no one understood was that the silence inside that hillside wasn't weakness. It was stability, and winter was about to test the valley harder than it had in a generation. Part 7. When the valley freezes solid, the real cold didn't arrive all at once. It crept in. First, the nights stopped forgiving mistakes. Then the mornings came harder, colder, quieter. By early January of 1895, Canyon Ridge Valley felt like it had been sealed inside glass. Temperatures dropped below -30 and stayed there, not for hours, not for a night, for days, then a week. And then, one morning before sunrise, the mercury sank to -37 degrees Fahrenheit. That was the kind of cold that turned survival into a full-time job. Inside the log cabins, fires had to be fed every 40 minutes, day and night. Men slept in shifts, boots still on, just to keep the flames alive. Smoke hung heavy in the air because dampers stayed closed, trapping heat but poisoning lungs. Water buckets froze solid inside kitchens. Frost formed on the inside walls, white crystals growing from breath alone. Children were pushed closer to hearths, blankets piled until there was nowhere left to move. Wood piles shrank fast. Families began measuring time, not in days, but in how many armloads of firewood remained. Every crack in the wall felt like betrayal. Every gust of wind found its way inside. Winter wasn't knocking anymore. It had moved in. And while the valley fought desperately above ground, something strange was happening on the hillside. There were no emergency fires, no frantic smoke signals, no sound of axes splitting wood at all hours. Just silence, the kind of silence that makes people uneasy. Because silence in deep winter usually means one of two things: comfort or catastrophe. Part 8, the walk up the hill by the 4th day of the deep freeze, concern turned into certainty. Elias Korven's hillside home hadn't failed loudly. It hadn't collapsed or burned or smoked anyone out. It had simply disappeared from conversation, and that worried people more than panic ever could. It was Martha Whitmore who finally said what needed to be said. Wrapped in layers of wool, she left her husband tending the fire and began the slow climb toward the hillside. Snow drifted high along the path, packed hard by the wind. Each step felt heavier than the last. With every breath, her lungs burned. She rehearsed what she might find: a frozen doorway, a family packed and waiting, or worse, no answer at all. The entrance to the hillside home was partially buried by snow, just as everyone feared. But there was something odd about it. A narrow path had been cleared. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough to reach the recessed doorway. Martha paused before knocking, bracing herself. This was the moment the valley had been waiting for. When the mad idea finally proved itself fatal, she knocked once, then twice. The door opened, warm air spilled out. Not smoky, not stale, warm. And standing there was Elias's wife, calm, unhurried, wearing no coat at all. "Come in," she said gently. "The coffee's still hot." In that instant, everything Martha thought she understood about winter survival cracked. Part 9. Inside the impossible warmth, the first thing Martha noticed wasn't the heat. It was the quiet. No roaring fire, no frantic movement, no tension hanging in the air. Just a steady stillness that felt normal, comfortable even. The stove held a small, controlled flame, no bigger than what most homes used for cooking. The air was dry. Her breath didn't fog. The walls were cool to the touch, but not cold, like the inside of a spring cellar. Children moved freely across the earthen floor, barefoot, laughing softly as if winter didn't exist outside that hill. Later that same day, when Caleb Whitmore arrived to see it with his own eyes, he brought a thermometer. He didn't trust stories anymore. The reading stopped him cold. 65 degrees in the main living space. The sleeping alcoves were warmer still, protected by canvas partitions and body heat, hovering near 68. Bread dough sat rising on a shelf far from the stove. No dampness, no condensation, no rot. And the fire, it barely consumed any wood at all. Caleb stood there longer than he meant to, touching the walls, watching the slow movement of warm air along the ceiling, then down the sides of the room in a gentle, natural flow. Everything he had warned against was working. Outside, the valley was burning through wood like it was fighting for its life. Inside the hillside home, the earth itself was doing the work. And for the first time since winter had settled in, the question in Canyon Ridge Valley wasn't how long Elias Korven would last. It was how long everyone else could keep going the way they were. Because the impossible had just become undeniable. Part 10, the numbers that humiliated everyone by the next morning, the story had spread through Canyon Ridge Valley faster than the cold ever had. People didn't argue anymore. They started counting. Caleb Whitmore returned to the hillside home with paper, a pencil, and a man's stubborn need to understand how he could have been so wrong. He asked questions Elias didn't volunteer answers to. How much wood had been burned? How often the fire was fed? How warm the space stayed through the night? The numbers came slowly, quietly. Since early November, Elias Korven had burned just over 1 cord of firewood. Not per month. Total. Caleb did the math in his head, then again on paper, then once more because the answer felt insulting. His own cabin, built with double-thick logs and the best stone chimney in the valley, had consumed nearly 9 cords in the same span. Other families weren't much better. Some had burned 10, some more. And still they'd shivered through nights where the far corners of their homes hovered barely above freezing, while sweat pooled near the hearth and frost crept up the walls behind their beds. The hillside home told a different story. Its temperature barely moved. 62 at night, 65 by midday, a slow, steady rhythm that ignored wind, darkness, and despair. There were no spikes, no cold corners, no frantic adjustments. The efficiency wasn't just better, it was humiliating. For the first time, the valley had to face an uncomfortable truth. All that wood, all that labor, all that suffering had been fighting the wrong enemy. Part 11, the earth does the work. Caleb stood inside the hillside home, his hand pressed flat against the clay wall, feeling something he had never considered before. The wall wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It sat at a steady, quiet temperature, like the earth itself refusing to be dragged into the chaos above. "This is your firebox," Elias finally said, breaking the silence. Caleb looked at him. "The hill," Elias continued, "not the stove. The stove only nudges the temperature. The earth does the holding." At 15 feet deep, the ground never froze. It didn't care about -37 outside. It stayed right where it always was, just above 50 degrees, year-round. That meant Elias wasn't heating a home from brutal cold. He was gently lifting an already warm space into comfort. 16 degrees of work instead of 90. The thermal mass of thousands of cubic feet of earth absorbed heat slowly, then released it just as slowly. When the fire burned, the walls drank it in. When the fire dimmed, they gave it back. The ventilation shaft completed the system. Warm air rose, slid along the ceiling, cooled slightly, then descended along the walls in a slow, natural loop. Smoke moved out, fresh air moved in. Moisture never had time to settle. No fans, no machinery, no moving parts to fail, just gravity, heat, and patience. Caleb realized then that everything he had built his reputation on assumed the earth was the enemy. Cold, damp, dangerous. But the truth was simpler and harder to accept. The earth had been offering help all along. Part 12, the bigger pattern humans keep missing. Once the shock faded, something deeper began to surface. Elias Korven hadn't invented anything. He had remembered it. Across history, whenever humans faced extreme heat or cold, they turned to the same solution. They sank into the land. They wrapped themselves in mass. They let the earth even out the violence of the weather. Hill homes in Eastern Europe. Earth lodges across the Great Plains. Cave dwellings in Asia that housed entire villages through brutal seasons. Different cultures, different names, same answer. But as materials became cheaper and fuel more abundant, people forgot. They traded understanding for convenience. They built faster instead of smarter, louder instead of quieter, and when winter came hard, they compensated with effort instead of wisdom. Canyon Ridge Valley had done the same. They hadn't failed because they were lazy or foolish. They failed because they assumed progress meant abandoning old knowledge. Standing there in the warm stillness of that hillside home, Caleb understood something that took him years to fully accept. Primitive didn't mean simple, and unfamiliar didn't mean wrong. Sometimes the most advanced solution is the one that has already survived 1,000 winters. And winter, whether in 1895 or today, still respects the same laws. Part 13. What this means for you today. This story didn't end in Canyon Ridge Valley. It's still unfolding right now, in every place where winter knocks out power lines, where fuel prices spike, where storms cut communities off longer than expected. You don't have to live on the frontier to face frontier problems anymore. Blackouts happen, supply chains break, heating systems fail at the worst possible time. And when they do, most modern homes reveal an uncomfortable truth. They survive only as long as everything else works. What Elias Korven built wasn't a relic of the past. It was a reminder, a different way of thinking about shelter that still applies today. You don't need to dig a tunnel into a hillside to learn from it. You can start smaller, smarter. You can reduce exposed walls instead of expanding them. You can use earth berms, even partial ones, to shield your home from wind and temperature swings. You can prioritize thermal mass, stone, concrete, brick, over endless layers of insulation that lose effectiveness the moment power or fuel disappears. You can control air before adding heat, seal drafts, create buffer spaces, let cold settle where it can't hurt you. Most people try to heat the air. The wiser approach is to heat the structure and let the air follow. That's the lesson winter keeps trying to teach. In a grid-down scenario, when generators run dry and deliveries stop coming, homes that work with physics don't just stay warmer, they buy time. Time to think, time to rest, time to survive. And survival isn't about having the newest system. It's about having the right principles in place before you need them. Part 14. Final Fire. Wisdom, not strength. I've watched winter strip away pride faster than hunger ever could. I've seen men who trusted strength lose everything, and men who trusted understanding make it through with less effort and fewer scars. That hillside home stood because Elias Korven didn't try to overpower the land. He listened to it. He accepted that the earth remembers things humans forget, that it holds steady while the world above it panics, that sometimes the safest place isn't higher, louder, or stronger, but quieter, deeper, and older. Winter hasn't changed since 1895. It still tests the same weaknesses, it still punishes the same mistakes, and it still rewards those who respect how the world actually works. If there's one thing I want you to carry from this story, it's this. Survival isn't about building bigger fires, it's about building better thinking. Because when everything else fails, when the noise fades and the cold settles in, the land is still there, waiting to help the people willing to learn from it. If this story gave you something solid, something you can apply, then stay with us here at Frontier Ways. We're not chasing trends, we're preserving knowledge that lasts longer than convenience. Tell us where you're watching from and what kind of winter your land brings. Every place has its own lessons. And remember this, the strongest shelters aren't the ones that shout their strength. They're the ones that don't have to.